All heavens were paper. All the trees around the world were pens. And all the oceans and seas were ink. Wouldn't be enough to describe what I see here.
My name is Matana, and I have an important story to tell you. A few years ago, I visited Yad Vashem, the Holocaust memorial in Jerusalem. The experience left a profound impression on me, but I left with a troubling question. Does anti-Semitism still exist today? If so, does it really have anything to do with me, a Christian? As you just heard, the horrors of the Holocaust are so vast that not even an ocean of ink could do the story justice. What I've learned, though, is anti-Semitism is an even bigger story that began long before the Holocaust, and it continues even today. Exploring the full story of anti-Semitism would be nearly impossible. The depths of anti-Semitism's evil are simply too deep. Instead, I decided to find and listen to as many stories as possible. I like to use the analogy of standing on the shores of anti-Semitism and dipping my toes in. With some friends, I took a journey across Israel and the United States to hear different stories and perspectives. Now, I would like to share those stories and what I learned with you. Before I start, though, you should know something. Once you hear these stories, you will become a witness. And bearing witness to these stories will change you. They will become a part of your own story. I had the opportunity to meet so many amazing people who helped me understand anti-Semitism and why I should care about it. Many of them were brave enough to share vulnerable, personal stories. First, Robert Nicholson, Dr. David Patterson, Khalil Sayegh, Daniel Goldwyn, Madeline Stapel, Dr. Phaedra Shapiro, Samuel Roberts, the Reverend Dr. Drew Johnson, Serene Hudson, Chloe Conson, finally, Judah Samet. Here's the first thing I tried to understand better. What is anti-Semitism?
I would define anti-Semitism as any unjust word or deed aimed at the Jewish people, whether as individual or a collective, simply because they're Jewish.
The term anti-Semitism arose in Germany in 1879 when a man named Wilhelm Marr created the Society for Anti-Semites, and the term Judenhass, Jew hatred, had kind of a vulgar sound, so anti-Semitism was introduced as a more sophisticated term, more palatable, and more attractive.
The cause of anti-Semitism is really mysterious to me. It is really hard to identify a very specific cause of anti-Semitism. It's such a universal phenomenon from my perspective. You go everywhere and you find it. You go to the back in history to the Soviet Union and you find the Jews are being portrayed as the capitalists, and they are the enemy of the people, and they are the enemy of the socialist, communist sort of movement. You go to the right-wing ideology, you go to the Nazi Germany, and you see the Jews there are being portrayed as the socialists, the danger to the nation, the outsider. You go to the Arab world and you see all sort of weird phenomena about them being this outsider, betrayal, psycho-religious sort of people. So it's hard to identify in one cause for it because it's such a universal phenomena, and in each context you have to take the context and look very specifically to what is causing this.
When I think about anti-Semitism and what did anti-Semitism used to look like, what does it look like now, I want to make sure we never think of it in terms of one replaces the other. Anti-Semitism is on a continuum. What was old becomes new again, what's new becomes old, and then it kind of recycles on itself and it all builds on itself. But in the end, regardless of the terminology used, regardless of the attack, anti-Semitism always has one goal, and that is to otherize the Jews, separate Jews out from society as a whole or one particular segment of society.
Anti-Semitism is sometimes put on par with racism, but I disagree. There's certainly a racial element to some anti-Semitism. There are other elements as well. But anti-Semitism is unique in being a comprehensive theory of the world. It is, in fact, mythical. It looks at the world and explains the world with reference to this small group of people scattered all over the globe who somehow have survived for century after century, and explains the world and the survival of this people as being connected to some grand conspiracy. This little people, though small and weak, is in fact, according to this myth, in control of world events, whether through banks or through politics or through the media or through Hollywood. Now, what's interesting about this myth is it's actually an inverted version of an original myth that actually comes out of the Bible. The anti-Semites do get something right in saying that the Jews are in fact extremely unusual, and they do stick around in history much longer than all of the empires and kingdoms that are rising and falling around them. And it begs an explanation. The anti-Semites give one explanation. The Jews survive because the Jews have been working together in this vast conspiracy. But the Bible, Christianity, gives a very different answer. The Bible says that the Jews survive because God has chosen this people and used them throughout history to bring blessing to the nations. That's the original myth of the chosen people. Anti-Semitism is the opposite of that myth. It's taking the chosen people and making them unchosen, taking the nation of blessing and making them a nation of cursing, right? And this idea, although subconscious, is deeply embedded throughout the Western tradition, and unfortunately, even within the Western church.
It's a hatred of the testimony that God has chosen the Jews to deliver to the world. God has chosen the Jews to say to every human is chosen, which means every human is summoned to a task that no one else can perform. In other words, the Jews, as chosen, are assigned. And none of us, I would suggest that no human wants this infinite responsibility. It's an eternal problem because it lies within the soul and not in the society.
According to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and/or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities.
The IHRA definition is controversial because it dares to draw a connection between individual Jews and the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, if you will, and the land from which that nation came. For most people, that's a very hard concept, right? The fact that Jews are more than just individual members of a global religious community. The fact that Jews belong to a people and that that people belongs to a particular piece of land is a stretch, and most people recoil when they hear that and think it's a bridge too far. Anti-Semitism can't be extended to a Jewish state. It's a political entity, it's not an individual. But if you understand Jews, Jewish history, Judaism, you know that there is an intrinsic connection between the Jewish individual and the Jewish people, and furthermore, with the Jewish homeland. It's unbreakable.
I mean, what this means is if you're always thinking about Jews as a group that shares a certain nature, that nature is something that is essential to who Jews are. It's something that's negative, that nothing can ever change, that this is deeply embedded within each Jew, and they are sort of programmed to be this way. So there's no individual, there's no interest in particular people or beliefs, or it's that this is the way this people, and therefore all of those people are.
Anti-Semitic movements are invariably purist movements, and the Jews are the source of impurity, contamination, contagion. The contagion is Judaism.
Something about the existence of evils like anti-Semitism makes people uncomfortable. What is anti-Semitism really about? And why does it exist?
So in the beginning, anti-Semitism was very theological. It was, the Jewish community, or Jews, they didn't accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. They participated in some manner in Jesus' crucifixion, and therefore they rejected Jesus, and therefore the hatred was based upon that theology. Over the course of time, that morphed, and we saw it become something about money and control and power. Interestingly enough, this idea of Jews controlling money was because the rules set in Christian Europe were that Christians couldn't lend money to other Christians, so the Jews filled the void, and then that became the thing. Then that morphed as money and power. Jews control Hollywood. It just continued to grow and grow, and that was something we had seen for generations. Then over the past 10, 15 years or so, we began to see a different variant, sort of a variation on a theme, and was looking at Jews in power, but specifically connected to Israel. And if Israel did something wrong, or if Israel was alleged to have done something wrong, then the entire Jewish community was to blame for it. And so you would never tarnish just this particular Israeli politician or this particular Israeli action. You punished Israelis, you punished Jews, you punished Zionists. That's been the morph. So the themes seem to change, but again, the end objective, how do we push Jews aside, remains the same.
I think anti-Semitism exists because people are different. Historically, Jews lived in separate communities, at least in certain places. And so when someone is separate, when they're different, they're not understood as well at the basest sense. But then people will misinterpret that and turn it into fear and anger. And so then in children, this will come out as bullying, and in adults, this will come out as anti-Semitism.
I believe that anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism are not the same. That it is a fundamental matter of conscience for people to be able to say, I disagree with Judaism, for people to be able to hold particular religious truths and not hold others, and to say, I don't agree with that. Then what happens is that anti-Judaism is mobilized by people who are anti-Semitic already. And then what they do is they make use of traditional Christian anti-Judaism to support their anti-Semitism. So while I believe those two things are distinct, it's extremely difficult to actually keep them separate.
The more I learned about anti-Semitism, the more I began to suspect that many Christians have played a confusing, troubling role. I had to wrestle with what that meant. Before we go any further, I want to share a few things I found important to remember. It is important to acknowledge both the pain of the past and the positive history of Jewish-Christian relations. Being a Christian who believes differently than Jewish friends is not anti-Semitic. Challenges to my Christian faith, like mistakes made by the church, don't need to be scary. Instead, They should strengthen my understanding and commitment to following Jesus.
Well, I think, speaking uniquely from a Catholic perspective, or as a Catholic would respond to this question, I would define anti-Semitism actually as the erasure of the Jewish people from not only the history of the world, but also from salvation history, in a uniquely Christian way, cutting them out of the story of our faith, historically and theologically.
There are people who would say that Christian anti-Semitism is an oxymoron. It's a term that we should not use because anti-Semitism is not truly Christian.
I would define anti-Semitism by both the conditions that allow for anti-Semitism and the actual acts and behaviors of anti-Semitism that we see. So I think for most of us, we're not actually committing anti-Semitic acts. We're not out there in the streets cursing at people, throwing stones, doing things that are obviously, racist or anti-Semitic. But I think there's a lot of ways in which us in the West, we contribute to anti-Semitic thinking, or at least foster anti-Semitic thinking, and especially in the church. And the church has a very particular and quite odd role in fostering anti-Semitism.
That Christians should not be anti-Semites does not mean that Christians never are anti-Semites. Christian anti-Semitism is a very real thing, and much as we wish that it wouldn't happen, it does exist. We need to be realistic about that.
A couple of years ago, in my own beloved church, when we were working through the book of Ephesians. And in Ephesians 2, it talks about Christ removing the dividing wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile and reconciling both groups into one new man. And this is a passage that goes deep into my heart and is so spiritually powerful. But when I was listening to the sermon, I was surprised that there is illustrations in expositing the passages of unfair and untrue negative comments towards the Jewish people. So as I listened, I heard things like the Jews were being blamed for setting up the wall of hostility, and illustrations of this being a known problem that Jews of that time would, for example, Jewish doctors refuse to help deliver a non-Jewish child or give any kind of care towards a Gentile person. Actually, there were hateful acts of Jews. And so I was really surprised and disturbed by those illustrations, and did a little bit more research and looked at some commentaries. And I found that some of those commentaries had these perceptions of Jews that they were the reason there was a dividing wall, instead of recognizing that the law of Moses and the covenant called upon the Jewish people to be separate. And so there was definitely a misreading of that passage. And with that misreading came illustrations that painted Jewish people very negatively as being the source of discrimination, the source of racism. And I actually felt these were tropes that were being repeated from history of Jews being the source of any kind of evil and the only kind of people that committed these sins. As a Christian, I felt that it was part of my responsibility to call it out and to not run away from my responsibility just because it was going to be extremely uncomfortable. And so I decided to write an email to our pastor and say, hey, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about the sermon, and could we set up a time? And immediately he called me. He said, yeah, can you love to get together? Can you give me a preview of your concerns? And I did. And the sound of regret and of realization was in his voice. And so quickly we put the meeting together, and we got together. It was 2 of the church pastors and my husband and myself, and we unpacked what we heard and what we saw in the scripture, that it was a misreading, as well as some of the history of anti-Semitism from the pulpit and acts of violence that resulted in demeaning Jewish people and painting them as the source of all problems. And the response was complete repentance. They were horrified that they had repeated unwittingly anti-Semitic tropes. And they more than just apologized. They actually went in front of the whole church and confessed what had happened, a repeat of anti-Semitic tropes in the sermon.
So I think that if we look at Christian attitudes toward Jews in the past, the sort of fundamental axiom is that Jews were responsible for the crucifixion, and as such, they have been cursed. They've been cursed by God. They are eternally in conflict with things of good, with things that are pure, with things that are innocent, and that because they're cursed by God, any suffering that they experience is warranted, that this is part of, the outpouring of God's punishment.
The idea that Jews are guilty of murdering God is also known as the deicide charge.
And Augustine wrote in the Creed, "The true image of the Jew is Judas Iscariot. The Jew can never understand the scriptures and forever will bear the guilt for the death of Jesus. The Jews held him, the Jews insulted him, the Jews bound him, they crowned him with thorns, they dishonored him by spitting upon him. They scourged him, they heaped abuses upon him, they hung him upon a tree, they pierced him with a lance." When you take the deicide charge and you apply it to an entire group of people for all time, it does come back. It's an eternal kind of charge because God is eternal. And so even the early church fathers spoke in these terms, that the Jew is eternally condemned for his rejection of Christ. And we saw this kind of application of the deicide charge even most recently within this year, earlier in 2021, when Israel was being attacked. There were messages out there that Israel deserved these kinds of attack on innocent civilians because they killed Christ. And that's really a shocking return of a very old evil.
Like deicide, blood libel created a mythology about the Jews as murderous and eternally condemned people.
The blood libel was the claim that Jews kidnap children, Christian children, or Muslim children these days in our own time, in the Muslim world. The Jews will kidnap the children and slaughter them in a ritualistic manner, take their blood and use their blood to make matzah the unleavened bread for Passover, and consume their blood. So it's a perversion of the Passover supper that Jesus conducted. This is my blood, drink this. This is my flesh, eat this. Think of me when you eat and drink. So the Jews consume the blood of an innocent lamb, of an innocent child, in this evil, satanic ritual.
Martin Luther wrote a book called Of the Jews and Their Lies. And in it he says, "And so, dear Christian, beware of the Jews. You can see how God's wrath has consigned them to the devil, who has robbed them not only of a proper understanding of the scriptures, but also of common human reason, modesty, and sense. Thus, when you see a real Jew, you may with a good conscience cross yourself and boldly say, 'There goes the devil incarnate.'" In Holocaust history, these quotes by Luther and others resurfaced and actually became policies of ratting out Jews, policies of discriminating against them, and actually saying that it was a good thing to murder them and to attack them. There is never a stopping point for what is written when it's about hate. It always develops into action. And you see so much of this in Hitler's writings, as well as his Nazi propaganda, Nazi policy against the Jews. Not just a resurfacing of Luther's views, but of a rushing in of his anti-Semitic sentiments and teaching Christians to harm Jews as an act of piety to God.
The Inquisitions were a series of investigations over several centuries where church leaders would attempt to find and silence alleged heretics, often violently.
There were 4 major inquisitions: the medieval Inquisition, Spanish Inquisition, Portuguese Inquisition, and Roman Inquisition. The aim of any inquisition is to root out heresy. Why? Because heresy, or false teaching, false belief, for the creed-based religion, salvation is determined by embracing the true creed, the true belief. Heresy threatens the life of the soul. The heresy targeted by the Spanish Inquisition was Judaizing.
In the Inquisition, people were forced to be baptized or die. And yet, even with those that did convert to Christianity, most of the people burned at the stake for heresy were the ones that had converted to Christianity, and even some of them genuinely, and yet they weren't able to escape the Inquisition, and many of them fled from those regions. In Romans 11, 17 and 18, it says, "But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant towards the branches. If you are, remember, it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you." So in this passage, Paul is talking about Christians, Gentiles, being ingrafted into the olive tree of Israel, and the root being the Messiah, Jesus, nourishing the entire tree. Paul is saying here that, hey, Christians, Romans, followers of Jesus, as Gentiles, we shouldn't be arrogant towards Israel. We shouldn't be thinking of ourselves as better because God made space for us on this tree. So much of what we hear from the anti-Semitic comments of the early church fathers, as well as Martin Luther, is not fear of the one that loves Israel on account of the patriarchs, but of arrogance and of pride and of hatred.
So if you look at Western medieval society, which was a medieval Catholic society, Catholicism was the religion of Western Europe. In that society, Jews were made to be strangers within their own countries, within their own cities. While they weren't necessarily killed en masse constantly or driven out, although that did happen repeatedly across the centuries, they were placed into ghettos. They were marginalized from the community. They were considered to be, they were the bankers, they were the merchants, they were those who committed the sin of usury, a sin that Christians did not commit, or at least Christians considered it a sin at the time, even though there were Christian merchants. But they were ostracized in that way. They were made to wear special clothes, essentially do business with Christians when convenient, but kept apart. From a theological perspective, both on the popular imagination and in the writings of medieval theologians, at best, Jews were considered a convenient testament to the historicity of Catholic faith, to the reality of God's promises, and perhaps a testament to the fact that the covenant had moved on from the old Israel to the new Israel. So they were useful to keep around in that way. At worst, they were considered the killers of Christ. They were thought of the Judas Iscariot was the archetypal Jew for medieval Catholics, at least in the popular sense. And that justified their social ostracization. There's this attitude, this understanding of a covenant, which began with the Jewish people, which the Old Testament testifies to, but is fulfilled in the new Israel, which is taken to be the church moving through history, the church as the stage that the covenant of God with his people, now expanded to the world, has taken at this stage in salvation history. And there's really no reason for the Jews to be Jews anymore. They are called to join the new Israel. And of course, as it's, I think perhaps based on an interpretation of Revelation, the understanding is that the final conversion of the Jews is something to be expected, and this fact, necessary, would foreherald the second coming of Christ. And so again, I think if we want to speak about medieval triumphalism, or the sense of a church triumphant over and against the Jews, it's in the sense that the Jews have been left behind. They're a relic of a stage that was necessary before Christ, but the kingdom has come into the church, and so the Jews are almost an inconvenience.
It's important to acknowledge that people who call themselves Christians have done much harm to Jewish people. It is also just as important to know that the remedy for Christian anti-Semitism is not secularism, which simply found new ways to express anti-Semitism.
Christian anti-Semitism hates the Jews because the Jews are the sinful nation, the ultimate sinful nation, the nation that crucified the Messiah. Philosophical anti-Semitism hates the Jews for inventing the concept of sin in the first place. Philosophers like Nietzsche, like Freud, hated Christianity because they hated the Hebraic values that undergirded it. They hated the concept of this Jewish God who had dictated to human beings a certain way of living, a certain kind of values, a kind of values that had kept Western civilization in shackles, unable to access its deepest self, forced to abide by an arbitrary set of laws that had no basis in fact, apart from the very clever nation that had invented them.
All of the socialists and communists, Karl Marx, Toussaint, Proudhon, Fourier, all atheists, were all wrote diatribes against the Jews, and some of them even invoking things like deicide. They don't believe in God, but they accuse the Jews of deicide. After decades of Jews trying to assimilate, Alfred Dreyfus was the the poster kid for the assimilated Jew. Totally French officer, not religious. He had his own contempt for the Jews, as far as that goes. He gets falsely accused, and then not just falsely accused, but what the turn was, the violence that broke out against the Jews all over France and into Germany and other places in Europe.
Alfred Dreyfus was a French Jewish military officer falsely accused and convicted of treason in 1894. His case convinced many people for the first time that Jews were not truly safe or welcome anywhere in Europe, and that might never change. This was a critical moment in the development of Zionism, the idea that Jews have the right to self-determination in their ancient homeland.
So you got Theodor Herzl, Jewish, assimilated Jewish journalist covering the trial, and he comes to the conclusion that this is not going to work. The Jews will never be safe as long as they are guests in somebody else's house, he said.
Tragically, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the threats facing Jewish people took another violent turn as pogroms started. Pogroms were a series of riots and violent attacks against Jewish people across Eastern Europe and Russia.
I mean, there's been violence against the Jews in Eastern Europe for centuries, but the pogroms, the waves of pogroms that stirred Jewish emigration out of Eastern Europe began in the 1881 with the assassination of Alexander II. Right now, this is a century, 19th century, is the century of the rise of socialism, communism, political movements against the prevailing authorities, against the church, against the crown, which is anointed by the church, right? There were Jews who were part of those movements, Jews who saw in those movements an alternative to the oppression that they were receiving from the church and from the crown. Right? So when Alexander II was assassinated by anarchists, communists, socialists, the Jews get blamed for it. The Jews living in villages, who know nothing about it, right? And the pogroms were serious. The pogroms were carried out with the approval of the church and the Tsar, and the monarchy. And it spurred the immigration of Jews out of Eastern Europe, beginning in the early 1880s. There was another big wave of pogroms in the early 1900s, 1903, 4, 5, 6. There were serious pogroms in the aftermath of World War I. You have these waves of Jews leaving Eastern Europe.
Part of what made Jews so unsafe in Europe was a book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was first published in Russia in 1903. The book claims to be a copy of notes from a meeting of Jewish leaders, and it promotes the conspiracy theory still popular today that Jews seek global domination.
And just, it gave the canard of Jews controlling the world, and it set up this premise that Jews are always more loyal to themselves than they are to no matter wherever it is they live. And that carries forward to today, is that Jews are more loyal to Israel. And you hear talk of the Israel lobby in Washington, D.C. That talk is not of a particular institution, it's the talk of a people. And that all began in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which has been published in almost as many languages as the Bible has been published in. And it continues to live to this day, even though it has been completely debunked. There's even issues where in some parts of the Arab world, it has been turned into miniseries and republished and treated as an actual document, a treatise.
So A few examples for how the protocols of the Elder of Zion have influenced the Middle East: the fact that this particular book is one of the best-selling books in Egypt. If you look at Kuwait, got parts of this book published in the textbooks of high schools, and it's widely studied. If you look in the Palestinian territories, you see it pretty prominent among professors and elites of the Palestinian people, and it's not that popular among ordinary citizens in the territories.
The scary thing is that anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are not just something ignorant people believe. Well-educated people believe them all the time.
The Nazis, first of all, were highly educated, highly sophisticated. Many of the leaders had doctorate degrees. They established in, I think it was 1929, the Deutsche Christen denomination, the German Christians, with their own ecclesiastic hierarchy. Hitler, the head of the church. They further de-Judaized Jesus, which had been happening since the Middle Ages, de-Judaizing Jesus, right? So Jesus is an Aryan. The Aryan is the Savior, comes to save us from the eternal Jew, who is this demonic figure in Nazi propaganda. No Jew or no person actually looks like that. It's an image of the invisible, of the one who's as invisible as Satan, and it's the Aryan, the German, the Reich, the Volk, and the Führer that will redeem us, deliver us, and bring us salvation from this evil. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, soon thereafter, the KGB archives were opened up, and many hundreds of researchers went and are still there going through these archives. They found, based on the archives, information on hundreds of mass graves that no one had previously known about. There's a priest named Patrick Dubois who wrote a book called Holocaust by Bullets, who has discovered more than 1,000 mass graves that no one knew about. So I know a scholar in Russia, in Moscow, who claims that it's closer to 8 million than 6 million, based on these now more than 1,000 mass graves no one knew about. I received an account from a survivor, a woman, who was in the women's camp in Birkenau, and the women's camp was right across from the unloading platform in Birkenau. And one night, there arrived a transport consisting entirely of children. They would typically take the children first. And she said that the women were awakened by the screams of mama, children crying for their mother. And the women in the women's camp started screaming. And it started spreading. And the guards were panicking and beating them and throwing blankets over, trying to shut them up. If there is one name that's being obliterated here, it's the name of Mama as it comes off the lips of a child. That's what the Holocaust is about.
Holocaust denial is never about history and facts. It is something that has an agenda. People deny the Holocaust in order to minimize Jewish suffering. They deny the Holocaust in order to delegitimize the Jewish people and our experience and our rights. And it's never just about facts and history. It's used in the service of a greater, quite dangerous agenda.
Judah Samet survived the Holocaust as a small child and truly knows the depths of anti-Semitism. He has seen more evil than I can comprehend.
I think that's why I'm still alive. Tell the story. Unfortunately, we see it happening again. Motar adam min habehema ayin. The difference between man and beast is zero. Well, I was born in Debrecen, Hungary. Debrecen is the second largest city in Hungary with 177,000 people. So it just shows you. The biggest city is Budapest, which has between 1 million and 1.5 million. 1 million to 1.5 million. And I was the third son. I had two brothers and a younger sister. And my name in Hungary was Imre. And we were prosperous, we were very Orthodox, which meant that we did not associate with Gentile children. First of all, they would beat us, you know. But anyhow, so we had our neighborhood, we had about 3-4 streets. We lived on 20th Street, and it was a row houses, and we lived across from the synagogue. And I believe that my parents were probably the biggest supporters of the synagogue. So when the Germans came, I was 6 years and 2 months old. And just to show you what the Nazis were, Hitler gave a direct order to the Austrians, to Germans and Austrians, not to deal with the Jews. The Jews would be put to death immediately. Anybody deals with Jews will put to death too. Oh yeah, I saw dead people. You know, my friends and I, we were walking, and usually we walked around the dead out of respect. But as we became weak, we stopped on the corpses. We could hear their bones cracking. How do you keep a memory like that? So when we arrived at the camp, there was like 2 stories high of corpses. I figured between 800 and 1,200. They were cleared up. Next morning, same thing. People just laid down and died. Anyhow, in Bergen-Belsen, when this British writer came, I don't know if he was a journalist. I think could have been not a journalist, but a writer that was sent there by some newspaper or something like that. And he sent back. And he said, if all heavens were paper, all the trees around the world, all the forests and everything were pens, and all the oceans and seas were ink, wouldn't be enough to describe what I see here in Bergen-Belsen. There were 13,000 corpses on the ground. Another 13,000 would have next day. They were dying continuously. They tried, chaplains came in, Jewish chaplains, and they tried to give him an honorable Jewish funeral. They couldn't do it, so dug a big hole with bulldozers and pushed them in. I don't understand how a people can descend so far into hell that even Dante could not describe it. Hatred of the Jews, period. You know the meaning of the word Holocaust? It's Latin, it's the burning. When you burn down a nation completely, totally. That was the plan, to kill all the Jews around the world.
Maybe you've never wondered this, but sometimes people will ask, why didn't the Jews resist the Nazis? It's a complicated question, and we have to be careful about the implications.
So I mean, I depending on who's asking, why didn't they resist? If it's one of my students, it's okay. Let's see, why didn't they resist? But I know in some cases, why didn't they resist is a way of fleeing from the responsibility that I have when I come face to face with this event. Well, they didn't resist. It's their fault. Can't be my fault.
In reality, Jewish people did resist the evils of the Holocaust. In fact, there was a massive, organized resistance network. In Holocaust-era ghettos, there were at least 30 armed uprisings. Over 100 ghettos had underground Jewish fighter organizations, and there were an estimated 35,000 to 40,000 partisans who fought in the forests of Europe. In 4 different concentration camps, there were uprisings as well. The Holocaust was a horrifying moment in the story of humanity. However, in addition to the resilience of the Jewish people, there were small glimmers of hope. The term righteous Gentile, or righteous among the nations, is often used to refer to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jewish people during the Holocaust.
They, in most cases, had every good excuse not to risk themselves or their families. Understandable excuse, you know. But they rob me of my excuses. They implicate me. So it's not just the evil of the Nazi that implicates, who is a human, who implicates me as a human, but it's the goodness of the one who helped that implicates me, that summons my responsibility, that asks me what God asked Adam, where are you? Where are you?
I mean, I think, so when we look at the history of anti-Semitism in the Christian West, and we think about 20th century anti-Semitism, most famously the anti-Semitism of Nazi Germany. Now, I think one can rightly say that perhaps the scientific anti-Semitism that the Nazis specifically espoused was a racial scientific anti-Semitism, and the Nazis didn't like organized religion as much as they hated Christianity as much as they hated the Jews. Yet, the perhaps racially based anti-Semitism or scientifically based anti-Semitism of the 20th century was able to play upon an entrenched religious anti-Semitism that had existed popularly in Europe for several hundred years.
Given the shocking horrors of the Holocaust, I desperately wanted to know, how did Christians respond afterward?
The fact that Catholics committed, there are both examples of Catholic heroes and villains from the Second World War, perhaps, I think, allows Catholics to rejoice in those examples of heroism, but also appeal to those examples of heroism to think, well, those Catholics who collaborated, those weren't representative of the church as a whole. But I think when you have the Second Vatican Council, and you have the church, the conciliar fathers were thinking seriously about the church's complicity, the Holocaust, and the fact that even if the Nazis had conducted the Holocaust, this took place in the heartland of old Christendom, in the heartland of Catholic Europe, really, even though Germany was the site of the Reformation. It was still a Christian continent, generally. It was a Christian culture that allowed this to happen. Historically, a Catholic culture that allowed that to happen. And I think reflection on that by the Council Fathers and not shying away from that fact is the thinking that ultimately leads to Nostra Aetate and this reevaluation of how the church is able to interact with Jews. So Nostra Aetate is a document that generally speaks to the church's relationship with other religions or peoples of different faith. It mentions Eastern religions, it mentions Islam explicitly, but most famously it talks about the church's relationship with Judaism and the Jewish people. And remarkably in the document, the church dispels the notion from the Middle Ages that the Jews were the killers of Christ. It puts that to rest. It condemns anti-Semitism explicitly. It uses the word anti-Semitism, and resituates the Jews in an undoubtable way, that they are the brothers of Christians, they're the brothers of the church, not just as an antecedent, but continue brothers in the faith, partners of a shared relationship with God. And while Nostra Aetate doesn't resolve every question about Catholic-Jewish relations, it's an ongoing dialogue to this day. It not only opened the door to that dialogue, but it made positive statements about the church relationship with Jews and acknowledges past church crimes against the Jews in a way that no conciliar document in church history had ever done before. The topic just was not addressed.
When we look at church documents, usually what they reference is other church documents. But what was really striking about the Declaration of Nostra Aetate from the Second Vatican Council is that it did not reference other church documents. It could not reference a church tradition in its effort to find a more positive approach to Jews and Judaism. What it needed to do was to go back to Scripture, and it was from that scriptural foundation that it found the ability to kind of really make a 180, a revolution in thinking about Jews and Judaism.
After the Holocaust, the world made a promise: never again. But is that really true? Did the story of anti-Semitism end, or is it still alive today?
One common misconception about anti-Semitism is that it happened once, and specifically in World War II, right? Adolf Hitler, the Holocaust, the gas chambers. Obviously the worst expression of anti-Semitism in history. But there are 100 levels of anti-Semitism before you get to the gas chamber. And what people don't understand is that all of those things are still happening today. They're still happening today. They're still happening in this country, in this city. Just yesterday, from the day that I'm sitting here now, there was an attack on a restaurant on the west side of Manhattan, right? Very Jewish area, kosher restaurant. And someone, driven by their hatred of the Jews, took it upon himself to get spray paint and write all over this kosher restaurant, F the Jews. Now, you can look at that and say, come on, it's whatever, it's graffiti, it's not a big deal. But can you imagine being that Jewish restaurant owner? Can you imagine being a Jewish resident of the west side of Manhattan, walking to the subway in the morning to go on your commute, and you see scrawled on this wall something that you in your mind had only placed in Nazi Germany?
So I woke up that morning. I was a little nervous, but mainly ready for my econ test. And then I get to the econ test. I do really well. I got like a 95, so I'm happy, I'm excited, I'm ready for the rest of my day. And as I'm walking to my next class in another side of campus on another building, I am just checking out the news in a newspaper receptacle that's right near the building I have class in. And I'm looking through the different versions. There's like 16 newspapers in that receptacle, so it's really a little bit of time to get through them. And then I look at the bottom shelf of it, and suddenly what I see isn't a newspaper, but a poster saying that people of my religion, that my community, are bad and do all sorts of bad things. And I'm shocked, of course. There's another guy there who's obviously not Jewish from the way he's acting, and that he's not abhorred by it, but rather ignores it. And yes, ASU has a very, very large campus community. Not everyone is going to care about everything, but I would hope that when we have something as horrific as the poster that I found, that people will respond appropriately. And I'm glad, ultimately, that I was the one who found it, because I knew what to do with something like that. Whereas a lot of other people wouldn't necessarily, and would just kind of not cover it up, but keep it to themselves. While my mind is racing with all these ideas of what I should be doing and what I need to do, and taking the poster off, my body is starting to shake. I'm starting to have an anxiety attack. And for the next 5-minute walk to class, I'm just kind of shaking and worrying and that kind of thing where it's uncontrollable. I get to class, I put my stuff down, and suddenly I burst into tears. I just cannot help it. Tears all the way down, really, really ugly crying. And I was lucky that there was a nice young lady there who hugged me and helped me calm down a little bit from it. And I'm really thankful for her. Her name is Neela.
The Anti-Defamation League has reported a scary rise in anti-Semitism for several years. In 2021, the statistics became especially alarming. Attacks against Jewish institutions, including Jewish community centers and synagogues, went up by 61%. Incidents at K-12 schools increased 106%. Incidents on college campuses rose 21%.
We are fortunate in Chicago. We have not experienced what some of the other communities have experienced. New York was seeing constant attacks on the street, especially pre-COVID. There was a rash of attacks in New York and some of the more orthodox concentrated areas of New York. During the May conflict, there were attacks in restaurants in Los Angeles where people literally walked into a sushi restaurant in Los Angeles and asked who the Jews were, began to physically attack them. Similarly, at the same time in New York, in the Diamond District and the Electronics District, where there's a lot of Orthodox businesses, there were in daylight, broad daylight, there were attacks. So the Chicago Loop Synagogue is the last full freestanding synagogue in downtown Chicago in the heart of the business district. It's no secret where it is. Its architecture is very obvious, has some large, famous stained glass windows, large sculptures sticking out from its edifice. It's a well-known institution, been around for many, many years. And I believe it was in 2017, and this was all caught on video. A gentleman drove by and he smashed up against the window some swastika stickers and then took off in his truck. Now, the Loop Synagogue has been around for a very long time. It doesn't have a huge congregation, but it has a very dedicated congregation. The congregation tends to skew older. And that swastika, as disconcerting and dangerous and scary as it is to someone like myself, even to older Jews, for whom the swastika was something they actually remember seeing in real life, some of them in person, it was profoundly frightening. And the fact that this man was so brazen in the busiest part of Chicago, and it was late night, but we're talking about in the heart of Chicago's business district, parked his car, got out, put the stickers on, and then took off, it was incredibly disconcerting. We've gotten used to, over the past few years, sort of brazen acts of anti-Semitism or all different kinds of racism. But this was sort of at the front end of it. And it was at a time when we knew that people said jokes and there were things happening behind our backs, but the brazen acts like this was really disconcerting in the heart of Chicago and Loop Synagogue. What came out of it, however, was fascinating, is that we saw a community rally, and we had representatives of a variety of different Christian churches who spoke. We had Muslims speak. It was a really powerful moment, and we packed the Loop Synagogue. And it said to the world that hate us as much as you want, we're not going anywhere, and we have friends. And that, I think, as even more so than the damage that was done, which again was easily fixed. This Loop Synagogue took care of itself, but the psychological damage was really profound.
What happened in Colleyville is actually a great example of what we're talking about. There's a synagogue in a small Texas suburb. 9 a.m. Shabbat services start. It's a Saturday. Jews are inside, just a handful of them. A man walks in from the outside. He's invited in by the congregants. He's a man from the UK of Pakistani descent. And at first, everything seems friendly. But the man says he has a gun and proceeds to take all of these Jews in the middle of their Shabbat service hostage, basically for the rest of the day. And why did he do this? Why did this man walk in off the street to this random synagogue in this random American town? It was because he wanted to push for the release of a convicted prisoner, somebody convicted of terrorism, and believed that the Jews in that synagogue, by virtue of the fact that they were connected to the global Jewish community, had the power, had the influence, or had the ability to pull the strings that would move the American government to release this political prisoner. Which just goes to show you the mentality that undergirds anti-Semitism. And some people, the FBI included, questioned whether this was anti-Semitism. But to the extent that this conspiracy theory, this grand myth or this anti-myth was the motivation for this man to take these people hostage, to threaten their lives with a weapon, it is for sure anti-Semitic.
Because it does happen, physical attacks, property attacks, a statistic that we've uncovered is that at Federation, we know amongst all of the different organizations we're familiar with that will report data, every year when you look at a budget, across the city of Chicago, the first $5 million spent every year on Jewish institutions is purely on security. That's $5 million that's not going to feed the hungry, that's not going to clothe those who need clothing or provide medicine or medical care or mental health assistance. It's going purely for security. And we know that in Chicago, we just completed, Federation did our decennial population study, that 63% of Jews fear anti-Semitism right now. I had an opportunity to speak to an Israeli scholar who was visiting the University of Illinois recently, and he brought up an interesting story that made me think about a play. Neil Simon, the playwright who died recently, wrote a play called Brighton Beach Memoirs. And there's a joke in the play about how when Jews talk about cancer, they whisper. They can be at full volume and they can say, she has cancer. And they whisper it, they want to hide it because they don't want to tempt fate. And he noticed as he was walking across campus, he would talk to a student and he would say, so what are you doing for the summer? And the student would be at full volume and then he would say, for the summer, I'm going to Israel. And he would whisper Israel. Or they would whisper that they were going to Hillel that night. Or they would whisper that they were going someplace for Passover. And he called it something the ancient Jewish whisper. And where this community that used to feel so confident now feels concerned. And they're not going to give up their Judaism, but they're going to hide it. And that's scary. We are in a country that was based upon the concept of all men are created equal. We're in a country where we have religious freedom. The First Amendment guarantees that. And yet now we have got kids on campus and kids in schools who are changing their clothes, changing their jewelry, because they're afraid of what that means.
It's never a good feeling. A lot of us feel scared both for our mental and physical safety. Professors will sometimes say things that are just a little on the edge close to anti-Semitism, and usually that makes us want to not talk instead of speak out and say something against it because they're in a leadership role. They have effects over our grades. We don't want to be hurt because we're calling out a professor for something, even if they're the one in the wrong there. Many of our students won't stand behind us. Jewish students will stand behind each other, sometimes, most of the time. But most of the general population is like, it doesn't affect me, so why should I care? And that's something that we really struggle with, is making people care. And so every non-Jew who comes as an ally to the Jewish community, we're immensely thankful for, and is really, really helpful in helping us combat anti-Semitism, both on campus and in the world as a whole.
Judah not only survived the Holocaust, he also survived a violent attack on his synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. On October 27th, 2018, a shooter attacked the Tree of Life synagogue during Shabbat services. He killed 11 people.
So I got there 4 minutes late, and the guy came, didn't say it. He says, roll the window down. And he told me, you better go back. There's a shooting inside your synagogue. And then he disappeared. All of a sudden, this guy appeared, was a detective. Behind the wall was about 2 feet from me. Okay? He had a pistol that was shooting 3 bullets. Okay? First, I couldn't believe that the policeman doesn't have better than a Saturday special. You know, the guy, and the shooting came from near the door. He was between 2 cars. I saw him from like his belly button and up. And I described their clothing exactly. So I didn't move right away. The soldier in me came. We learned when you hear shooting, you don't start shooting back. Find out where it's coming from. So I got to see the guy. And I was investigated by the FBI, not investigated, interviewed 4 times. They wanted to make sure my story stands straight, no deviation. It was over 2 years, like And then I heard that they said that I described them to the T better than anybody else because everybody else was Trump. They say he was a fat guy. I said, no, he was trim, handsome, nice head and all that. I described his clothes. He had a white shirt, he had jeans, and he had jeans on. The policeman had a jean jacket, white shirt. That was the weekend, you know? And I wanted to know, who was this guy that warned me? And I couldn't find. I called the FBI, I said, it wasn't us, maybe the police. I called the police. It was somebody else. Somebody said, well, you know, maybe. And I said, no. I remember him. He was a good-looking guy, black hair, and so I'm in the synagogue, the big synagogue, 3 months later. And we finished services. I'm going out, I'm going to go to my car. And I see this guy keeps looking at me and smiling. So finally I went over, I see you are smiling. So he went like that. He showed me to roll down the window. He said, you are the one who saved my life. His name was, he still is, Hank Feinberg, my life. Because what I would do if he didn't come, I would get off my car. I was in the handicap lane, the last car. Get off my car, go to a little walkway to the entrance, and I would be caught right in the middle. I want to know why didn't he kill you? First of all, his danger was from the policeman, not from me. Secondly, maybe he couldn't see me clearly, see through the window, to the windshield window, clearly. The government wants him dead. I said, no, I don't want him dead. That is too easy.
At this point, you might be wondering, do all these stories of anti-Semitism in the United States have anything to do with Israel? Since 1948, and even before, Israel has been in conflict with Palestinians. That's another story with a lot of complex factors to it. So how is anti-Semitism related? Israel is not home to all Jewish people, but critics of Israel tend to blur the lines between it and the broader Jewish community. In a nutshell, legitimate criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. Attacking Israel is anti-Semitic when it delegitimizes its very existence, discriminates against it, or demonizes it by applying familiar stereotypes about Jewish people. One of the key reasons why anti-Semitism in the United States is connected to Israel is because conflict with Israel is often used to justify attacks against Jews elsewhere.
Most of the Arab anti-Semitism that we see today is an outgrowth of the establishment of the State of Israel. To the extent that Jews did not have power, did not have independence, did not have sovereignty in the Islamic world, on a land considered sacred to Islam, Jews weren't a problem, right? They'd been superseded, they were out, right? Okay, they maintain their little small community and do their little rituals. They're not threatening. We'll tax them and they can sort of stay the way that they are. But when the Jews dared to say, we're not just a religious community, we are a people, we are a nation, we have a language, we have a homeland, and by the way, we have a capital, and it's called Jerusalem. That's when the Islamic world and the post-Islamic world of Arab nationalism said, okay, now you're going too far. Now we have a problem with you, and we are going to do everything that we can, working together, to destroy this political project at its moment of foundation. And that's what you saw in 1948.
I think anti-Semitism in the Palestinian context is much more unique and particular than the entire world. Why? Because I think that the experience of the Jewish people and the Palestinians have been very interesting since 1948 and before that. When the Jewish immigration to Palestine started increasing, and at a moment where Palestinians start feeling more and more nationalistic, and their sort of Arab pride and nationalism was increasing at the same time, it became clear that both would clash. The Jewish interests have clearly conflicted with the Palestinians' interests at that time. And that was a moment where Palestinians felt the Jews are a threat. And as a response to that, all sort of attacks between both people start happening toward each other. Now, Palestinians start referring to these new immigrants as al-Yahud in Arabic, the Jews. And from Palestinian perspective, until today, when they are using the word the Jews, they are not really referring to the al-Yahud of the word, the Jews of the word. They're referring to these Jews, the Zionists in the land. And that's when they are educating their children that the Jews are bad. What they are saying is like, we are not really saying it's the Jews, we are saying it's this Jews, the Jews who are attacked us. And thus, it's very difficult in the Palestinian context to know when is it anti-Semitic and when is it not anti-Semitic, rather it's just nationalist. We have this conflict with Zionism.
History shows us that if we want a future, a world with Jews in it, we need to support the existence of a Jewish state. That does not mean that we need to agree with every policy of the government of the Jewish state, but we must support that there is a national homeland for the Jewish people. Supporting a Palestinian state alongside the Jewish state of Israel is certainly not anti-Semitic. That's an absolutely legitimate position to take.
Well, again, it's if Israel does something, or if Israel is alleged to have done something, then the Jews are attacked for that. One of the most common refrains that we hear that is really frightening, and I've heard it for years since I was a pro-Israel activist on campus, was "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." So at first, it's one of these chants. You hear it, it's in the background at different marches and so forth. You'll see it on posters. But then you have to think about, what does that actually mean? So let's break it apart. From the river to the sea. The river is the Jordan River. The sea is the Mediterranean. Israel is that small piece of land the size of New Jersey that sits in between those two borders. So if you're saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, that means there is no Israel and there are no Jews. And if we think back to the lead up to the 1967 war, the Six-Day War, what Gamal Abdel Nasser was saying was we're going to push the Jews into the sea. And this refrain, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is nothing but the modern day version of just that. So as if I think about anything that is the most frightening to me, that is what I hear is the eradication of a country, it's the eradication of a people, it's the eradication of a way of life. And yet people are so flip about it that they put it on t-shirts. But when we think of Zionism, when Jews debate and discuss and how do we define Zionism, we think of it in these terms. Every people has the right to self-determination. Zionism is the manifestation of a Jewish right to self-determination. If you are opposed to Zionism, you are opposed to Jewish self-determination. That's anti-Semitic. Why should Germans and Russians and French have self-determination but not Jews?
Protesting Israel becomes anti-Semitic when it uses traditional Christian anti-Jewish imagery to suggest that because Jews are responsible for the crucifixion, they are dangerous, they are powerful, and they are enemies of the good and the weak and the pure. Protesting Israel becomes anti-Semitic when the Holocaust is minimized, or even, as we've seen, glorified. Hashtag Hitler was right. We've seen all of this just in recent months.
A lot of people usually like to accuse everyone who's, say, any criticism of the government of Israel as he's anti-Semite or that's an anti-Semitic. That's not a precise thing to say, because the Israeli government, as any different government, has its good things, it has its bad things, and thus people have the right to criticize the government of Israel, specifically when it relates to the Palestinians. You've got people who are living under an occupation, their life is controlled by the army, and there are a lot of things there when it relates to the occupation that you can criticize and you should criticize to promote the human rights of the Palestinians. However, the criticism of Israel can be used to justify anti-Semitism or to push anti-Semite agenda.
The relationship between anti-Israel sentiment and anti-Semitism can also be illustrated by the BDS movement, which stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. The BDS movement seeks to marginalize Israel politically and economically because of the Palestinian conflict.
BDS is anti-Semitic because it's the political aspect of anti-Zionism. BDS is the movement that, politicians around the world can look at and be like, oh yes, that's the movement, whereas anti-Zionism is the philosophy.
I believe that BDS is anti-Semitic. It is premised on a hyper focus on the Jewish people as embodied in a Jewish state, and a belief that this state is exceptionally bad. So bad that it's the only country that needs to be highlighted. And so bad that it is inconceivable that the solution could involve dialogue with this Jewish state. Because what BDS does is cut off the state of Israel. It says that the state of Israel is so deep in its sin that it must be severed from polite society. It needs to be cast out like a leper, right? Boycotted, divested from, and sanctioned, completely isolated from civilization, right? From the rest of us who are very upstanding, of course. I think to that extent, to the extent that BDS is premised on this double standard, this idea that the Jews are supremely sinful and must be cast out, it is just a much larger version of the same spirit of anti-Semitism that we've seen throughout Europe for the last 2,000 years plus.
Unfortunately, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was not an anomaly. People still really believe conspiracy theories, and they can be very dangerous.
There is this idea among supremacists, that first of all, Jews created what we have now, the plague. They created it because they created a medicine against it.
Well, the global conspiracies began with the world Jewish conspiracy, right? That the Jews secretly control everything. It's like from Protocols of the Elders of Zion is the original global conspiracy document. So when you see things like QAnon, it's Protocols of the Elders of Zion on the internet, gone digital.
So in today's politics, as polarized as they are, you could take our most radical left-wing politician or activist with our most radical right-wing politician or activist, and they'll have nothing in common. You can't put them in the room and find common ground on anything, save one issue. They have anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic or Jew hatred strains within them, and they both want to separate. So from the right, what do we hear? It's a lot of the sort of the traditional canards. It's money, power, loyalty, some of the theology-based anti-Semitism. On the left, you hear some of the same. It's a little bit of money, it's a little bit of power, less on the theology, much more about Israel, saying that Israelis are committing apartheid. Israelis are committing genocide. Israelis are committing ethnic cleansing. Well, it's fascinating. They use that broad term Israelis. They rarely just mean Israelis. They're not just about the IDF or a particular member of Knesset or something. They're painting with a very broad brush. And Israeli Zionist just becomes the stand-in. It becomes a way for the left to avoid the obvious attacks of anti-Semitism. In this country, we know the KKK is horrific. Neo-Nazis are horrific. Skinheads are horrific. If you portray yourself as one of those three things, you're immediately ostracized in most corners. But the left has found a way to sort of voice the same issues but hide behind a different messaging. And I want to be clear, it's not everybody on the left. It is the extreme left, the same way the extreme right has a problem. The vast majority of informed, caring conservatives want nothing to do with the KKK, et cetera. They don't think of the Confederacy in a positive way. It's the extremes that are troubling, that really use this language. And again, what I find so fascinating is they will agree on nothing in politics. But if you fed each other their anti-Semitic canards, they'd find common ground.
I came to realize that anti-Semitism has many forms, and they come from a variety of sources. In some instances, Christians have contributed in harmful ways. But I couldn't help wondering, what about me? If I haven't done or said anything intentionally anti-Semitic, what does it really have to do with me?
I resonate with this quote from C.S. Lewis. He says, "If ever the book which I am not going to write is written, it must be the full confession by Christendom of Christendom's specific contribution to the sum of human cruelty and treachery. Large areas of the world will not hear us till we have publicly disowned much of our past." And this is very true in my mind about Christian anti-Semitism and the role of the church.
This is what worries me. Anti-Semitism is a harbinger of decline. To the extent that America is becoming anti-Semitic, we are in big, big trouble. We need to fight anti-Semitism because it's the right thing to do for the Jews. But beyond that, it's the right thing to do for all of us, because this is a cancer. And this is a cancer that, until it's uprooted, will destroy everything that we care about here in the United States. There are 3 reasons why Christians should take a stand on the issue of anti-Semitism. First of all, it's the right thing to do. Right? The Jews, to the extent that they're human beings, deserve to live in peace, to say, I'm Jewish, and not feel threatened. That to me seems indisputable, and everybody should be able to agree with that. The second reason is more Christian. We are in debt to the Jewish people. This is the people from which our faith, all the things that we care about, emerged. But beyond that, even worse than that, notwithstanding the fact that we came from the Jews in a significant way, it's been us, Christians, of different denominations, in different periods, in different countries, who have done the most to oppress and to persecute the Jewish people. Our debt to the Jews is doubled in light of all of the terrible things that we've done to them.
The way my faith have shaped my views on anti-Semitism is that, I think the Bible is a Jewish book, both the Old Testament and New Testament. People would like to think of the New Testament as a Greek book. It might have been written in Greek, but it's very Jewish. The literature, the quotation, the writers are Jewish. And our Lord Jesus Christ was an observant Jew. So you cannot really read the scripture and comes out of it as God hate the Jews by any means. What you would come out of it if you faithfully read the scripture is that these are great people who have kept the Bible alive for us. And that's something that we should appreciate. The second point why my faith has been very important to me with regard to anti-Semitism is the fact that it pushed me to take the decision that I'm going to also try to love my enemy, the people who we've seen as enemies for a long time, which is the state of Israel, right? And to claim that you want to love your enemy is an easy claim. But in practice, what you are trying to do when you say, I want to love my enemy, is try to understand their plight, try to understand their suffering, what they have went through. That was the point where I decided to study and read more about the Holocaust, about things that have happened to the Jews and things that are happening to the Jews today. And that was when I read about anti-Semitism.
So the particular reasons why Christians of all people should care about anti-Semitism are manifold, that begin with the fact that every Christian stands on a branch that extends from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, through Israel and the Jewish people. So there's a sense in which any kind of just tolerating anti-Semitic behavior or fostering it or creating it or participating in it, there's a sense in which that is like sawing off the branch on which you're standing. It just doesn't make any sense.
I don't think any Christian alive today necessarily bears this personal guilt for the actions of the medieval church or even stuff that happened in the early 20th century. But nonetheless, we live in the world that our Christian forebears made, with the good and the bad. And you can't ignore that context. You can't wish it away. You might not feel guilty about it, but nonetheless, it's always in the room. And it necessarily conditions, any interactions that we have with the Jewish community. And so I think there is an obligation on the Christian, perhaps even imitating Christ in the same way that Christ died despite being sinless himself. We are not sinless ourselves, but I think we do have a responsibility, a call to try to make atonement for those sins which we might not ourselves have committed, but sins that were real nonetheless. And it's a duty to right those wrongs.
In 1986, there was an accident in Chernobyl, Ukraine, nuclear power plant. One day, one chimney, one cloud of radioactive material goes into the air. 2 weeks later, radiation levels in Montana were elevated. In the Holocaust, we're not talking one chimney one day. We're talking dozens of chimneys operating for 1,000 days, casting to the winds the ashes of the Jewish people that settle over the earth, that are in the bread that we harvest from the earth and the bread that we put in our mouth. It's kind of a grim Eucharistic image. Those ashes are asking, where are you? Where's your brother? What have you done? Who we are as humans lies in saying, here I am for you.
This is probably one of the hardest things for American Christians to get their mind around, and that's that I think the biblical authors would say that you as an individual cannot be ethical according to Scripture. That the right moral decisions are things that the entire community must live out. And we know that because God holds the community accountable for their decisions and their behavior. And I think one of the easiest ways to picture that is, how many times have you heard somebody say, well, I'm not racist. I love these kinds of people who are accusing me of racism, or I have lots of friends of lots of different languages and skin colors and ethnicities. And what they're doing is they're sieving down racism and problems of racism down into like individual ethical behaviors. Well, I don't do it, so I'm good to go. But like environmentalism, it doesn't matter if I'm the only one collecting cans and recycling, right? It doesn't matter if I'm the only one not pouring poison into our wells or into our streams. It doesn't matter if I'm not the only one pumping carbon into the atmosphere and doing all the things that we just know are questionable, let's put it that way, environmentally. I need to convince other people, hey, you need to recycle too. Like, environmentalism doesn't work. We're not gonna like get the lead out of our system unless you get the lead out of your system, we get the lead out over here, and we clean up this wetland or this dump or whatever is causing the problem for us. And I think that's kind of the biblical author's view of how Christianity, the Hebrew people, and then later Jesus followers should operate. It doesn't do any good for just me to listen to the words of my Lord and Savior and then follow them. I need to convince other people, these are the kinds of things that we're supposed to be doing. These are the kind of people that we're supposed to become. And I can't become the kind of person I'm supposed to become unless the community is also helping me to become that, and I'm helping the community.
Sometimes you don't have all the answers because your story doesn't fall into a neat category. Then what?
My name is Chloe Conson. I'm a Passages alum. I went to Israel in summer of 21. Today I have with me some very important family documents from both sides, some pictures of my great-grandparents, and some letters and other documents that tell us about their history. My family story as it relates to anti-Semitism is a little bit complicated. I have Russian Jewish grandparents on my dad's side and German great-grandparents on my mom's side. We know that my great-grandfather had to serve in the military and that my great-grandfather on the other side had to flee Russia because of anti-Semitism. I know that this pictures of my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother on my dad's side. His name was Michael, but he went by Mick. I know that he had a lot of siblings, and his older sister left significantly before him and moved to Africa. When he was a young teenager, he left Russia as well due to a lot of persecution against Jews going on at the time. This is a picture of my great-grandfather on my mom's side. He was from Germany. This is a picture of him at 17 years old when he joined the Luftwaffe. I know that it seemed he was only in the military for about 2 months before he got captured by the Russians and then was a prisoner of war for 4 years. We know this is true because we have a record that he wrote himself in 1956. It talks about when he went to school and then that he joined the army in February of 1945, was captured in May of 1945, and didn't get out until April 1949. I don't have any reason to believe that he was involved in anti-Semitic behavior. My mom seems to think that he wasn't, and she grew up with him, but I've only met him a handful of times. This is my great-grandmother on my mom's side, her labor pass. I know that she was forced to work in a Nazi soup kitchen for some period of time, and this is from when she had to do that. I did have a relationship with her, and I knew her to be a very kind person. That doesn't preclude where she grew up or what she was forced to participate in, but I don't have any reason to believe that. I think these stories are confusing and complicated, and it's hard for me to not just hold all of them in my mind and try to process like where all of my family is coming from, but also to reconcile it with the people that I know. I know my great-grandparents, and I have grown up living across the world from them, so obviously I don't have a super close relationship with them, but I do know them as people, and it's hard for me to imagine them in Germany during World War II. So I think it's confusing. I think the family stories that I've learned have shaped how I think about anti-Semitism because it helps me remember that it's not just an out there problem, that people in my family that maybe I didn't meet, but people that I know met them and were raised by them were directly affected by anti-Semitism. If I was my great-grandmother in 1940s Germany under pressure to be anti-Semitic, I honestly don't know what I would have done. I really hope that I wouldn't have given in, and I really hope that I would have tried to help. But I don't think that I can say 100% that I would. I don't know what she was facing, and I don't know what I would have done. And I think that's scary for me to not know. Complicity is really hard to define, I think, because it's really complicated. There's a lot of questions you can ask, like how much did the person know? Did they know the consequences of the actions that they were taking? Were they acting under threat of punishment? If so, what was it? And at least for my family, I don't know the answers to a lot of those questions, so it's hard for me to say what they were or weren't complicit in. But even just thinking about it makes me think about what I might be complicit in today, what I am turning a blind eye to, or just not being aware of because it's hard for me to be aware of it.
Feeling that I couldn't stay silent, I asked every person I met one last question. If they could ask Christians to do one thing about anti-Semitism, what would it be?
When a synagogue is vandalized, again, it is not hard for us to reach out and to find people to speak against that kind of anti-Semitism. When a person is attacked, again, the public is very easy to stand up for. Stand with us when it's public, when we ask you to. Reach out to us when we don't ask you to. That's a powerful statement to us. We, in the end, may say, don't worry about it. We're covered. we're not going to make a big deal. But your phone call to us is so powerful because that sends a message that we're not alone. And then those quiet moments. When someone says something, they make a reference, they make a joke, for you to call them out for that, that stops it. That stops the bleeding early because that joke is rarely isolated and that joke builds and becomes something else. And I've seen Jews do it. Imagine how much more difficult it is for us to do it because we're the ones who are feeling attacked at that moment. No one's attacking you as a Christian. You are just standing up for what's right.
There is a moral obligation for Christians to provide support for Israel because Israel is the only Jewish state. Israel is the one place that Jewish people are protected by their own government, by themselves, and it's a haven for them.
Bearing witness, understanding remembrance as testimony is crucial to allowing holiness to enter this realm. It's crucial to human relation. It's as important as responsibility. To relate a tale is to enter into a human relation. And it goes to a responsibility for those who aren't here yet. Our responsibility exceeds the horizons of our lives. Don't be silent. No, we're commanded in the Torah, in the Bible, do not stand idly by your brother's blood. The anti-Semitic remark is an exterminationist remark. The anti-Semitic remark is where shedding blood starts. And you can't stand idly by your fellow human beings' blood.
If I could encourage Christians to do one thing that I think would help future-proof them against anti-Semitism, it's simple. Become deep, intimate, lifelong friends with Jewish people. Study with them, listen to them, learn from them, argue with them, which if you're lifelong friends with Jewish people, you will absolutely argue with them. But do everything you can to be close and intimate with them so that you don't dehumanize, you don't other them, you don't distance yourself from them. And then when these temptations and issues and ideas that eventually can lead to anti-Semitism come up, you can say, no, because I know these people. I know who they are, I know what they're going, I've heard their view. I don't even agree with everything in their view, but I know who they are and I know what they're talking about and I get them. There's only one way to get people, and that's to spend time in community with them.
I think to fight anti-Semitism, it doesn't mean you have to be out there protesting, doesn't mean you have to be posting the correct hashtag on social media, although that's well and good. It's building positive bonds with people, building friendships. Fighting against prejudice consists not only in speaking truth to power against wrongs, but cultivating relationships in the good. Don't just read books about Judaism or Israel or Jewish theology. Go and meet Jews. Go speak to them. It's if they are open, if they are willing. Get to know these people. Go to organize a Shabbat dinner. Engage the Jewish community if you're on your college campus. Get to know the Jewish Student Union. And I think it's so much of this culture can be erased, not necessarily in screaming against the anti-Semites, because that might entrench them in their positions, but actually building bonds across religious and social divisions and creating, not primarily Jewish or Christian relationships, but primarily friendships. That's the way you dissolve hate.
The world is filled with remembering and forgetting, as it is with sea and dry land. Sometimes memory is the dry land that is firm and founded, and sometimes memory is the sea that covers everything like in the flood. And it is forgetting that is the dry land like Ararat. The thing about anti-Semitism is it is not simply a memory content to live in the past. It never truly goes away, even when you think it has. It saturates and stains society. Sometimes it is loud and works publicly. Sometimes it hides in the most unexpected places and works quietly to do harm. Some people might be lulled into complacency by this. Those who don't touch anti-Semitism directly often don't know about it. Those who don't know about it can never do anything about it. But here's the thing. We know about it. You and I have heard stories of real people touched by anti-Semitism in horrible ways. We have also heard many examples about how people can respond to these stories. Now, we are witnesses, and the stories of anti-Semitism are waiting for our response.